And our next session will be led by Brian Kennish from Massive, How to Survive an AI Apocalypse. So please come take your seats and give a round of applause to Brian. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me in the back? Yes? Okay, cool. All right, everyone, so the title of my talk, as Cameron said, is How to Survive an AI Apocalypse and Win at Screen Scraping. As Cameron said, my name's Brian. I am the co-founder of Massive. So the premise of this talk is that because of the rapid progress of artificial intelligence, we are living through what I consider to be the most uncertain time in at least modern human history. So in the first part of this talk, I'm going to give you my thoughts about how to do decisions around planning, in particular planning about what to work on from the perspective of a product manager type. And then in part two, I'll talk about how I and our developer team is using current AI tools effectively or not so effectively, as the case may be. Before I get into all that, I'm gonna run quickly through my background, or at least attempt to do so quickly so as not to bore you. Soon after I learned how to code, I was hacking on screen scraping projects, mostly to do with extracting product data from Amazon and elsewhere on the web. Later, when I was looking for a job, I thought about what company was doing the most interesting things in the screen scraping space. And for me at that time, that company was Google, where I ended up working for 7 years, most notably on the Chrome browser and helping to launch the Chrome extension system. After Google, I started a privacy company called Disconnect that initially started out as a browser extension. The company has since evolved to be more enterprise, privacy, and security focused, but some of that early code that we wrote has been integrated directly into many of the major browsers. Then for a number of years, I was an independent app developer, helped build many apps for companies, as well as some of my own, and 7 of these apps went from 0 to over 1 million active users, including AdBlock Fast, which is one of the most popular mobile ad blockers. But despite some of those successes, we were always running into monetization problems with our apps, either because we couldn't or didn't want to just show ads in the apps. And that led us to founding Massive. Massive provides an SDK to app developers that those developers can integrate into their apps and let their users opt in to pay for each of the apps, the entire app, or premium services within the app with a small amount of their leftover or idle computing resources. Then we at Massive take those little bits of CPU, GPU, storage, memory, and bandwidth and aggregate them into services. Today, our main service is a residential proxy network that's used by companies to gather business intelligence. It's used by monitoring companies to monitor the performance of web apps around the world, and security companies to evaluate whether sites are doing malicious activity or have malware on them. And I won't bore you with these details, but our network ranks at or near the top of the performance benchmarks from Proxyway, which you can check out yourself. We also have a couple of newer beta products. The first being a data center proxy network, works just like the residential network, except it's faster and cheaper for cases where the data center IPs are sufficient for your use case. And then we are starting to get into structured data in the form of a search API that gives you parsed results from popular search engines. And I'm going to talk later some about how we built that using AI tools. If you want any more information about Massive, just head over to joinmassive.com. And if you'd like to get in touch with me or get any of my links, briankennish.com. All right, so around the time that I started my career, this book came out called The Singularity is Near by Ray Kurzweil. Has anyone read this book or is familiar with the author? All right, so a few of you. I was expecting no one, but for those of you that are not familiar, Kurzweil did I think, more than anyone to popularize this notion of the technological singularity. It's not a term that he coined. That would go to that credit would go to a scientist named John von Neumann, who made contributions to a lot of different fields, including early computer science. And he himself borrowed the term from physics. I personally failed college physics, but I will do my best to explain the concept. So when physicists started plugging variables or values into Einstein's relativity equations, they found that there could emerge these points of infinity that they dubbed singularities. An example that was later discovered would be the black hole that is pictured in this slide, which is a point of infinite density. And at these points of infinity, or at these singularities, the known laws of physics break down and it becomes impossible to make any predictions about what happens there. And by extension, the technological singularity is the point at which we humans invent an AI that is slightly smarter than ourselves. And theoretically, that AI can invent an AI slightly smarter than itself, and you get a recursive explosion of intelligence, at which point it becomes impossible to make any predictions about what happens next. Kurzweil, in his book, makes lots of predictions or forecasts, and one in particular that he made in The Singularity is Near is that in the year 2029, we would reach human-level AGI, artificial general intelligence. A few years ago, this would have looked like an absurd prediction, but now not looking so absurd. And just to take this framing out of the realm of futurism or sci-fi, the CEO of Anthropic recently said that he thought within 3 to 6 months, 90% of all code would be written by developers, and then within 12 months, 100% of code. And he said this a month and a half ago, so we are now 1.5 months away from the beginning of this timeline. Okay, so what do we do with this information? I was gonna do a little math lecture here, but in the interest of time, I'm gonna hand wave this and just skip to the conclusion. This is the expected value equation. It helps or calculates the value of making certain decisions. And it turns out that the value of trying to prepare for a world of superintelligence is negative, meaning it's a waste of time. And my simpler explanation for why this is the case is if 350,000 years ago you said to whatever the smartest creature on Earth was that humans were coming and that they should start to make preparations, there's really nothing reasonable that they could have done to prepare for the coming human species. And likewise, it would be naive or arrogant for us to think that we can somehow prepare for a world of superintelligence. But what we can do is treat that as an extreme outcome on the continuum of outcomes and prepare for everything else that's in between where we are now, up to but not including a period of exponential explosion in intelligence. And for how to make those kinds of preparations, I would refer you to another book, which is The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. I'm guessing more of you have read this book or are familiar with it. Show of hands. Okay, a few more. When I started at Google, this was the most popular book among product managers. I think may have even been mandatory reading for them. And in the book, Christensen talks about two types of innovations, disruptive innovations and sustaining innovations. Disruptive innovations would be like the PC, which initially start out looking like a toy in that they are underpowered or have less features and are cheaper than whatever the top end of the market currently supports. In the case of the PC, that would be mainframe computers the size of this room. However, because these disruptive innovations initially generate such little revenue, they are very difficult for incumbent technology companies to justify investing in them because it would mean so little to their bottom line relative to the amount invested. And as a result, these disruptive technologies tend to iterate quickly and catch up and ultimately surpass the incumbent technology. On the other hand, we have sustaining innovations like the GUI, which can be equally important technological breakthroughs, but rather than disrupting incumbent tech companies, tend to get adopted by them into their existing products. So in the case of the GUI, computer manufacturers, OS vendors just integrated GUI features into their existing line of products, and it just simply made their products work better. So throughout my career, I've always been on the lookout for disruptive new technologies, and I would have argued until a few years ago that there really had been none in my career, like the last definitive one being the World Wide Web itself. There have been candidates like cloud computing, the smartphone certainly. Blockchain was looking disruptive, but really hasn't found the utility. And now we have AI that is looking very disruptive. But what I realized more recently is these things are not so absolute. New technologies always tend to have aspects that are disruptive and aspects that are sustaining. So if we look at the smartphone was certainly disruptive for companies like Microsoft because they lost their operating system monopoly. Also disrupted for taxi companies because Uber and Lyft and others came along. On the other hand, it was sustaining for companies like Amazon and Google because people could now buy products or search from wherever they were and therefore did so more often. So what does this have to do with AI? So when we think about AI, the key, I think, is that we want to evaluate the things that we're working on now and determine if they are going to be sustained or disrupted by improvements in AI. And obviously, we want things that are going to be sustained. So our products should instantly improve when underlying AI gets better, rather than be things that are likely to be incorporated into foundational models or built by the AI labs. So just to summarize what I talked about so far, our best bet for maximizing our value now is to assume that the progress of AI is going to look like an S-curve rather than a J-curve. That is, there's a period of very rapid growth, but eventually flattening out, rather than one that's straight up exponential. And I think if you can read some tea leaves, that's sort of what we're starting to see, where we've had this period of very, very rapid AI progress that seems to be slowing down a bit. And then we want to be working on products that are complementary to AI rather than substitutes, meaning that AI can substitute for what we're working on. A clarifying question that I like to ask myself that sort of gets at these 2 points is, today our customers are all human, as far as I know, but what would happen in the future if, to our existing products and future ones, if most of our customers were agents instead? And the reason I think that this is a fair possibility is I looked at data from password manager services, and they report on average, their average user having over 100 accounts. And I think many of those accounts are likely to turn into agents. Some of those accounts would turn into many agents. So I think we could see a world in the near future where each of us has dozens and dozens of agents working for us 24 hours a day. Just imagine the effect that would have on the usage, either positive or negative, for your products. So to give an example of something that we're working on, this search service that I mentioned, I happen to think that human search usage is about to go down significantly if it hasn't already. I just judge this from, anecdotally from my usage and developers that I talk to. I think I used to search maybe 50 times a month, 50 times a day, and maybe now I search 50 times a month. So at least an order of magnitude drop off. However, I've also been R&Ding agents, and many of them start out with a web search. So I think search usage from agents is going to more than make up for the decline in search usage from humans. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to more of the developer landscape, the current developer landscape. But first, I'm going to start a little bit in the past here. So I made this slide of some of my favorite startup services that I could remember from the past. 3 of these you probably haven't heard of because they never really made it out of the US. But Sprig and Munchery were meal delivery services. They delivered high-quality meals to you on demand for about $15. And to give you an idea, these meals, if you went to a store and bought them, probably would have cost more like $20. And on top of that, these companies were delivering them on demand to you. MoviePass, you may have heard of. It was a because they had a rather spectacular implosion. It was a company that was letting you, for less than $10 a month, see up to one movie per day. And I don't know what the price is for a movie here, but in the US, it costs more than $10 to see a single movie. So you can see maybe, besides having really good products, why these may have been some of my favorite startup services. They were heavily subsidized by venture capital. I call this, and not an original thought, but I call this business model, selling $1 for 2 quarters. I hope that translates. And it's not a stupid business model. It worked very well for Uber. I think Uber is now a $150 billion company. But the premise of the business model is that you give away your service for much less than it costs, but eventually you become a monopoly and have pricing power that a monopoly has, and you can raise your prices, which is exactly what Uber did. In the case of Uber, though, they burned more than $30 billion to execute on this model. And as far as I can tell, that's more money than any company has ever burned. So why am I talking about these random services? Today, my favorite startup services include those of OpenAI and Anthropic and the other major AI labs. And to be clear, I find these, their services to be mind-bogglingly good. Like I say to people, if a time traveler had come to me a few years ago and shown me the ChatGPT interface and had me guess what year they were time traveling from, I would have guessed 2035 or 2040, but we have these tools today. However, in the last year, OpenAI and Anthropic are reported to have burned $5 billion. This year, OpenAI is projected to burn $14 billion and Anthropic $3 billion. The reason for the discrepancy in these numbers is one is an external projection, one's an internal number. The actual number probably falls somewhere in between. But the point is that these companies are on pace to absolutely smash Uber's record for burning the most cash ever. And it's really hard to see how they can have an Uber-like outcome. On the one hand, if their thought is that they're somehow going to invent a super intelligence and then control that and capture the value from it, as I mentioned, that's kind of a naive or arrogant proposition. And if they're thinking that they're going to become a monopoly and gain pricing power, as all of you know, their products are very similar today. The switching cost is very low. It's hard to see how any of these can become a monopoly. So if we listen to what the media is telling us, if we listen to certainly social media hype, if we listen to the leaders of the large AI labs, as developers, we're supposed to be crying because our jobs are about to go away. But my thinking is that we should actually be crying laughing, because we have these amazing tools that are the compute for which is being paid for by investors. And I don't think this situation is bound to last very much longer just because of the huge amounts of money that's being lost. So we should take advantage of these tools now while we have them. And here are my thoughts on how we can do so. So I tried to find some objective data on the productivity gains that developers have made post ChatGPT and the other LLM chatbots. I couldn't really find any good data, and it's kind of a problem with the AI world in general, is that we don't really have good objective data yet. So in the absence of that, I'm gonna give you some anecdata, which is my own personal data. I pulled 10 years of my Git commit history prior to ChatGPT. The absolute numbers don't really matter here, but the point is it's pretty flat. And then I added what happened the year post ChatGPT, which is that, oops, we had this big spike. So I'd like to think I was a pretty productive developer prior, and my own personal productivity measured in terms of commits went up by about 3x. And talking to other developers, I think those that have really dove into using AI tools have had similar levels of productivity increases. So I culled together some lists of how I have achieved this and also how our developer team has. And here are the different ways that I and our team have been effectively using AI tooling. So the first is to treat the AI chatbots as a fleet of junior engineers. When I first started programming, many tech companies had this like master apprentice model where a lead engineer would have a number of junior developers assigned to them. The lead engineer would mock interfaces like function declarations, hand them off to the junior engineers to fill in, and then the lead engineer would review the work. And that's quite similar to the way that I've been using LLMs. All the sort of tedious grunt work I've been handing off in well-defined chunks, and then carefully reviewing what I get back. On the other end of the spectrum is code review. So I saw earlier that many of you are founders, I'm guessing some solo entrepreneurs as well. This is certainly a deficit that as startups we have, is not having the time to do really thorough code review. Certainly solo entrepreneurs have this even more so. And for the last couple of years, I've given every piece of critical code that I've written to an LLM. And nowadays, since we have so many of them, I sort of hand these off to a council of LLMs. And I would say for every maybe 3 or 4 bugs that I'm catching in the code that LLMs produce when I treat them as a junior engineer, when I treat the LLMs as a senior engineer and have them review my code, they're probably catching about one bug in my code. And I expect over time that's going to be more and more, that ratio will be more and more balanced. The really valuable thing that I found, though, is to prompt the LLMs to give you a list of considerations, things that you should think about for the code that you've submitted to them. And this sort of serves as like a checklist. And if I find things on the checklist that I hadn't thought about before, it's a good indication that I haven't really thoroughly thought through the problem yet and probably should think through it more before committing my changes. And then in the middle of these two things, I've called pair programming here. I think this is the reason personally for the big gain in my productivity, which is just sort of talking through problems and design considerations with the LLMs. As I'll mention later, for the types of things that I work on, which tend to be quite R&D heavy, and there isn't necessarily a lot of examples on the web for either in the form of code or documentation, the LLMs have nothing nothing relevant that they were trained on, and so aren't very good at giving me answers. But just the act of talking through problems, I think, has made it so that where I may have gotten stuck on something for days or even weeks in the past, I maybe get stuck on for only a day. And I think that's, that really accounts for the majority of my personal route. Then I've made this next list of things that I think LLM should be good at right now or in the near future, but I just personally haven't used them for. The first being test automation. Another big deficit of startups, solo entrepreneurs, is not having adequate or full test coverage. And I think LLM should be very good at writing tests. And this is also a pretty low stakes area where if the LLM makes a mistake, well, we just get an error notification that you correct the test. Also, I haven't found a lot of startup services doing this, so if any of you are looking for a startup idea, I think this would be a really good one. Another really good one, another really good startup idea is would be to do a QA service. So this would be more of an agentic role. And I haven't seen anything that exists yet in this area, but just having an LLM hosted role that would hammer on interfaces, find potential security and other errors where I think would be valid. Yep. And then third one, our team has been using much more. So which is to produce documentation. As you know, LLMs are great at reading documentation, also Then finally, some things that the current generation of LLMs are clearly not good at. I alluded to earlier, I called this debugging, but I have yet to get an LLM to help me solve a truly hard problem where I was working on something for which there is not a whole lot of open source code more documentation about. The LLM feedback in these cases has kind of been worth less than nothing, where I just got that down the wrong road. And second is creativity. LLMs are really good at remixing, I think because of limitations in their reinforcement learning. They're not as creative as other AI models have been, like you've probably heard about AlphaGos and AlphaMoods. We don't see that type of creativity yet in LLMs, only by pursuing the So finally, I want to talk a bit more specifically about how you've used these different tools in building a real service. So the search service that I mentioned earlier, we built over the course of about 3 months. Probably without AI tools would have taken us at least double that amount of time. There are 3 main components to such a service. First, we have a cluster of browsers and mobile devices that actually go fetch the results pages, make sure they're not being blocked, it can actually access these pages. Then in the middle, we have the parser that takes the raw HTML from these pages and turns it into structured data. And then we have an API that does the mechanics of accepting requests and returning results. So as I mentioned before, the browser cluster, the unblockable browser cluster, is the part that is really has very limited working open source code and write-ups about how to do it. So LLMs were especially not valuable in this case. And I want to call out here Luigi, who spoke earlier, who I think is producing the best content if you're interested in this particular subject. And then on the other hand, we have the interface part. This is something that is quite trivial today. And I think LLMs would be quite good at giving you code for this. I happen to have written a lot of APIs and designed them, so we didn't really need AI help in this particular area. But if we had, I think using LLMs would have been very valuable. But where we really gained a major speed up is in the parser component. So search engines today can return many, many different types of results. And to have manually figured all those result types out would have taken us dozens, hundreds of hours, especially because these are not well documented. If they are documented, they're documented across a wide swath of different documentation, not in one place, which is exactly what LLMs are great at. They get trained on all the documentation. So the classification part, we got a huge speed up from working with LLMs. And then the other part, our parser is based on CSS selectors. And here the results are more mixed. So this is, others today have spoken on this topic, so I won't go too much into it, but we certainly always gave results HTML to one or more LLMs to get them to give us back CSS selectors. But often we got back very long, brittle CSS selectors. So things that may have worked immediately, but were unlikely to be stable over the long term. And we were able to somewhat mitigate that by prompting for more stable selectors, but ultimately we had to tune these things by hand. Another approach that we could have taken, but may have not been so cost effective, was to have some sort of method of catching errors or self-correcting these longer, more brittle CSS. But the approach that we ended up taking was to use use this sort of junior engineer. We got an initial CSS selector from the LLMs and tune them up ourselves. So I will stop there and take any questions that you all have. I hope that was useful. Thank you.
I was curious, as someone that's studying computer science right now, when we're talking about elements related to that place, junior years, I think a big concern can be all my classmates have is, does that mean there's still all the need for graduates? Yeah, just kind of curious to get perspective of that.
You know, I thought about addressing this topic while I was speaking, and I don't really have a great answer other than I think there's a lot more onus on engineers coming up to sort of graduate from a very early stage to a more medium stage of developer. I don't necessarily have great advice on how to do that, other than get really good at using AI tools and keeping up to date on how they can help you. And really, I mean, I guess when I was at Google, I think I interviewed over 1,000 engineers to every people. And I would say the biggest thing that I saw that still applies is that so many of the potential engineers that we interviewed, even ones that, they mostly went to very good schools, had done so little project work on it, right? And that's the thing that I always look for, is like having really implemented stuff, real stuff yourself, rather than just relying on your CSS process. So that'd be my biggest advice, is just do your context. And, if you get to the point where you can accelerate your development skills, your productivity enough, you don't need to be a job, right? You just gradually doing your own projects. It kind of treats their that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Will. So at the beginning, we were talking about the AI companies like OpenAI and Anthropic earning a lot of money. And let's see, we're also saying that, like right now, we kind of have the tools, but in the future, we might not have them because they don't have clear way to make the money back. Could you elaborate a little things a bit more on this? Because I'm just thinking that right now we already have some very good LLMs. There are also some very good open source models here. So do you mean by that like we won't have access to the newer models, or will it just get more expensive this year?
Yeah, so I think I didn't say that optimally, but I meant to say was that I don't think we're going to have these tools that have these prices, right? These very discounted prices. So something is going to have to change. Either they achieve their goals of become out, they do that super intelligence, or they're going to have to jack up the prices. But yeah, the fact that we have, the fact that these tools are getting commoditized in the form of open source tooling means that the current set of tools that we have, I think, will continue to have in some form. But the continued investment in new tooling seems suspect at this point, just given the huge company loss here. Hope that clarifies.
Yes, thank you. And then I wanted to ask, you were saying that you use LLMs for classification of the search results. Could you give us an example?
Yeah, so if we take our search service currently, so we use Google, Bing, and DuckDuckGo. So if we Google as an example. When you do a Google search, you can get, I don't even know the number, but there's dozens and dozens of different search results types. So you could get video results, you could get obviously the standard organic results, you could get ad results, you could get location-based results. There's dozens and dozens of these things. And Google doesn't produce a document that says, here are all the results types that we might give you. Rather, they have this spread out over many, many documents, if they have it documented at all. And so we would have either had to, by trial, to figure out what all of these result types are, or what we actually did was we kind of asked we just asked LLMs to do works. And it wasn't perfect. There were hallucinations. I've had crazy cases with LLMs where, like I was working integrated with an API for the entire day. I stupidly never actually tested my code. And then at the end of the day, I realized that the LLM had hallucinated the entire API. So I decided this now to face this code. So yeah, so in the case of classification, there were some hallucinations which we had to self-correct. But for the most part, LLMs were very, very useful. That's your the types that I go for search engines.
Thank you. Jen, leave me. Be better. Did you? You said. Good.
And hello, I think it was a really interesting talk. And I'm curious, maybe if you have thoughts on, because you can correct me if you disagree with this, but my understanding of like the early internet was that it was sort of everything was VC funded and was sort of driving this VC money, and then the dot-com burst, and there was this model of like advertising, and then every company became like an advertising service, and that was how these really big tech companies made a lot of money. And so do you envision a future in which these LLMs that are losing a lot of money maybe pivot into a model like that, where the money is coming from some secondary service that is high profit and that can kind of avoid the need to make money to be available?
Okay, so I wasn't quite around for the beginning of the internet and specifically the web companies. So I don't know exactly how it was funded. I was around when that transition happened. Was people just putting content on the web and not really thinking about a business model to everything becoming advertising funded. And it's interesting, I never really thought about it, but like, I guess advertising works so well that people kind of neglected to really look for other business models. And until a few years ago, like when in-app subscriptions really took off, there really wasn't a whole lot else they could do other than run ads that would be out. Could you repeat this or clarify the second part of your question? Were you asking, do I think similar thing will happen with LLMs, but where they'll be ad funded, or
Or just some secondary service like advertising, so maybe content that is too new to ask. I'm hungry today, and maybe there's some advertising-based service. This is kind of a hypothetical, and I guess it's not really like a yes or no question.
If I had to guess the way these things would evolve, it would be exactly what you suggested. I've heard some talk about like Perplexity, others really to investigate, having sponsored content in their album, which I think would both be unfortunate but make a lot of sense, right? And that is maybe a way that they can support these models, although it's tricky to see that they can work as well as ads and scripted search or clusters and contextual ads on websites work. Just because it would seem like it would be so hand-fitted. Like the thing about ads and search is that they're really unobtrusive. I think for the users that end up clicking the most on ads, they probably don't even know that they're ads versus organic content. At least now, most of the users of LLMs are maybe a little more technically sophisticated. Maybe we would start to, maybe we would notice that content is sponsored and doesn't really fit. So I'm a bit skeptical that that would work, but I'm certainly sure that I'll try that. There are incredibly smart people that work at the AI labs, and I'm sure they have a lot more stuff in mind than I can figure out. But it's hard for me to see how they're going to justify the huge investments that
About coding and LLMs, do you think that developers who use it regularly and who rely on it will lose their edge eventually? Just like go through projects and how the loss of how the LLMs becoming more expensive or accessible will have an effect on how some people let it share.
The thing, so I'm pretty skeptical about this whole vibe coding thing. At least, yeah, so making very particular prototypes and stuff makes sense. But for like the experiments that I've done in terms of like their program so like that you use like that will be in terms of Python with like where you don't well it's as these goes it's pretty insane and get into these games where they can't seem to solve simple level but he's still on it more than this. So I think we're gonna end up regardless of what happens with a lot of the code problems looking at code bases. I expect for that reason like what the my experience engineers think even more valuable in the future. Probably gonna have to go into a situation where the code just advances on this listing runs by AIs, figure out the area and understand and it's like figure out themselves and just take large stores before trying to give it to them. And as far as using developers using their edge, probably that's going to happen for many developers, but if you're a more experienced developer and you are intent on having that happen, certainly can use the LLM tools to or whatever for AI takes to improve your skills, right? So like I know I would instead of searching what do all these days, I'm asking the LLM solutions all day without various coding things that I should have done. So it's an incredible learning, not just for coding, but basically for that answered your question.
Yeah, it's also like you were talking about like also you kind of also answered the question I wanted to have like what should a developer do with the Apify? So it's like it's also you are saying learning something you are asking a lot of questions about as it done already.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm probably spending the same amount of time talking to developers all day. It's probably not and the rapids shoot down. But I find it both an incredible learning tool and also just a great way to bounce ideas off of. I guess like I haven't yet gotten to LLM to solve any of these tricky problems that I've been working on, but like yeah, so I remember I've learned this memory trick a long time ago where like if you have a word in your mind, you think of it, you start reassociating words or names and pretty quickly think of and I think I've been using LLMs in a similar way where when I'm thinking through a design problem, say, just asking, bouncing ideas back and forth with an LLM, maybe it's not giving me the ultimate answer, but just talking through the problem helps clarify, define the problem, which we're not more like, this is like something right to this go.
Yeah, like you said with the haircut and also after LLMs becoming getting priced differently, the expensive, I think the also like way will go away or change.
So I really showed it earlier to like not being listen data on this really not what AI space, but specifically in terms of productivity. I learned something that was new a while ago. Microsoft set it up in Adele, which is that instead of judging by previous benchmarks, we're aiming to see the global GDP increase by more than 10% year on year to judge when we have reached human level because that's like a really objective benchmark that has nothing to do with all of these very specific AI benchmarks. Now I lost my train of thought. What is exactly your cover?
Yeah, about bike coding and
Yeah, so I'm still kind of waiting to see like if the vibe coding works so well. Where are all these amazing like AAA features that vibe components that not right like this stuff? If and when we start to see those, then that will become a favorite vibe. But until then, I'm kind of waiting to see more objective results than just people on social media saying like, hey, I vibe coded for 6 hours today, and amazing, like I built like a startup from scratch. Like, I found skeptical with those guys. Maybe why I think you're right. There may be good odds to go there, and all I but not. I guess the comment for every question. Now, that question. Yeah, so I'm waiting for developers or others to show me incredible results that are being claimed on social media and plan the step in that pursuit.
Stay English. Basti.
So, I'm sorry, your presentation had many interesting points, language by singularity and tickled my comments, but at the same time, it's not so good. So, I feel like you are holding back. So, give us the juice. What do you believe will happen? Give us the unhinged truth, because you promised how to survive the AI apocalypse, but it wasn't there. So, give us the honest.
Yeah, so I purposely did not make specific predictions because I think humans are quite bad at making predictions. I personally used to be like a semi-professional poker player, so I think a lot in terms of probability. So I should expect value, meaning that there's a range of outcomes that can happen, and place your bets on certain ones because that increases your odds of maximizing your value. And so my point was that I think we can safely ignore the extreme case where we are inevitably headed towards this technological singularity because there's really nothing we can do about it. None of us, like even if you're, a senior researcher in an AI lab, like whatever is going to happen in that area is going to happen. You can't really control that outcome. But what we can control is making our bets on all the other range of outcomes. And like I said, if I'm reading tea leaves, maybe it seems like AI progress is slowing, but then again, we could have a new breakthrough out of nowhere, just like, transformer technology was a breakthrough out of nowhere after we had this very, very long period of what was referred to as the AI winter, where progress was not made for decades and decades. I would also say, though, that if you look through human history, people have always thought that we were very close to something that we weren't necessarily close to, and have always compared the latest technology to sort of a version of AI. Like, people thought like, the hydraulic systems were the way the brain worked because they were, this amazing new technology. People often likened steam engines to the way the brain works. And so while it looks like what we have now is very similar to how we work, certainly produces output that's very similar to what we output, it's not necessarily, we don't really know. The fact that we're so close doesn't really mean we're right on the doorstep of having this incredible breakthrough technology. So that is to say, my title was a bit provocative and,
So the message is we don't know.
Yes, but that's always the message, right? We never truly know.
Yeah.
Hi, I will ask you, how much Google has spent on developing Google Chrome before launching it?
Okay, so pre-launch, there was a very small team of engineers working on Chrome. I don't remember exactly how many, but on the order of like a dozen or so. It was a very small team. By the time I left Google, if I remember right, there were 500 engineers working on Chrome and 500 on Chrome OS. So it started as a very small team and then scaled up very quickly as the browser got more and more popular. Also, when I left Google, Chrome's market share was 3% of the browser market, and now it's, I don't know, 90% or something. So even though we had already scaled to 500 engineers, we still had made very little traction in the market.
Was it
Released before Google Chrome or Chromium?
Sorry, repeat that question. Was it released before Chromium?
Chrome,
Yeah.
Google Chrome or Google Chromium?
That's a big question. I remember, I think Chromium and Chrome were released at the same time. I believe it was an open source project from its launch, but it could be mistaken. So no, here it is. Thank you. Thank you. Wait.
Okay.
It's a little more than we're on. The phrase, but we're going to this. Good.
So nowadays, lots of these OpenAI, they exactly the websites they get blocked because they have only products that's blocked because they try their headless browsers and then they cut off.
How do you see like normal websites or normal businesses that of course they know the IP addresses of, let's say, Googlebot or Bing or all the bots? How do you see in the future that it will work with, okay, this is a legitimate private user trying to use our product rather than news that was not okay for the final website?
Yeah, one of the frustrating things about the internet is that new companies do crazy things like Google going out and scraping the web, and then they sort of get grandfathered into being allowed to do these things and no one else is allowed to do them anymore, which is why I like being in this business. I like giving new developers the opportunity to do what Google, for some reason, is grandfathered into being allowed to do. As far as like the, for AI training or real-time answers, the LLMs accessing websites, it's a really tricky question because of the copyright issues. And I expect it's going to be played out over a very long period of time and court cases. So I don't know. I don't know how that's all going to transpire. It sort of gets to like, what is the business model of these things ultimately going to be? Because what we have now is not long-term sustainable. So if these, end up being, say, advertising based, and there's a real incentive for a website to be crawled by an LLM because they somehow make their money that way, then sure, like it'll make sense for everything to be reopened up a lot more than it is now. But it really depends on how like the business model part plays out, I think. Thank you, everyone, and thanks for coming and staying. It's great to have met many of you.
Thank you again, Brian.